Welcome, my wonderful YouTube people. We've got a Noam Chomsky video. The video itself is a little old, and he looks like he might be a little bit younger even than he was 5 years ago. Noam Chomsky on the civil rights movement, Vietnam War protests, and how to make changes. Dr. Chomsky, take it away.
I mean, we're all, practically everybody here, I'm sure, is from a pretty privileged sector of the population. You have lots of opportunities. You can speak, you can write, you can organize, you can reach out to other people. If you keep doing it, it can have an impact. Take, say, something like the women's movement. I mean, a lot of you are old enough to remember how that happened. I mean, it began with very small consciousness-raising groups. Groups of women getting together and talking to each other and coming to comprehend, and a lot of it's internal, to comprehend that you don't have to accept oppression. That there is oppression, first of all. Like if you'd asked my grandmother, is she oppressed, she wouldn't know what you were talking about. Of course she was hopelessly oppressed, but it just wasn't, that's life, you know, it's like asking, do you breathe? So just getting to understand that you don't have to accept oppression. You can be a free, independent person. And then came efforts to accept.
This is something that I see a lot of people talk about, the idea of, why don't people realize they're oppressed? Well, because no one wants to be oppressed. And if they can convince themselves that they're not oppressed by whatever trick they can, then it's hard to convince them otherwise. This is how we get people like Candace Owens, who's up there on stage talking about how great conservatives are and how Trump is going to make America great again. Oh, man. Every time let's see. It's going to have the clip.
From New York and on the new Hot 97 app, Ebro and the
America was actually one of the slavery was
America. Are you trying to make
audio about 15 minutes ago? I don't know if I could tolerate it again, but I guess it sets it up nicely. So play the T.I. clip.
If you haven't seen this before, it is amazing.
Right there, the third one. There you go. Run that. This is T.I. and Candace Owens.
When you say make America great again, which period are we talking about? The period when women couldn't vote? The period when we were hanging from trees?
I'll answer.
Or like the crack era? Which period in America are you trying to make America like
so
again?
I actually think that I would totally rock a hat right now that said make Black America great again. Because Black
No,
America,
make America.
before,
We're talking about make
not the hat.
America.
But
That wasn't the question.
I am answering your question.
Which period was America great that we're trying to replicate?
Well,
Which era was it? Tell me.
I think I'll answer your question.
Tell me.
I'm ready to answer your question.
Which era was it?
What?
Which era was so great?
Here's the thing that you guys are forgetting. America was actually one of the slavery was all over the world. All over the world. America was. No, I'm not saying it's okay. So why are you saying oh?
Hey man.
America was one of the first countries.
I want to like you so bad.
I'm
Because
trying
you're
to
so
answer your question.
smart. I want to like you so
If
much.
I can't answer the
I want to
question,
hear
it doesn't
y'all. I
matter.
want to be able to hear them. I want to be able to hear
If I
them.
can't answer the question and you're just going to boo when I say slavery was all over the world, which is a fact, why are you booing a fact?
Because you're making light of.
No, I'm not.
You're making light
I
of
haven't
the
gotten to my points.
enslavement
I'm not
of
making
people that look like us. You can't make light of that. That ain't nothing
I
you
haven't
breeze
even
over.
finished the sentence. How am I making
You
light of
started
anything?
with some bullshit.
Okay.
Yes. Oh, that gives me life. Okay, so people like that, people like Candace Owens, who have deeply internalized the fact that racism is over, that we all have equal protection under the law, there's no such thing as discrimination. Those people are really hard to convince that there's an issue. The only way you can is either to have it demonstrated to them by society, or to plant a seed and leave them to grow. Leave that seed to grow.
Expand. And there was bitter resistance. You know, it wasn't easy by any means. And in fact, there still is. and there's a backlash and so on and so forth. But you just keep struggling for it. Now, the civil rights movement, it didn't get anywhere near Martin Luther King's dream, but it did have effects. Big change from, say, Alabama in 1960. Not things that are bad, but not like that. And it had the same way. It started with, it goes back decades, of course, but it really took off when a couple of young black students sat in at a lunch counter 60 or 51 years ago. They were arrested, beaten, and so on. Pretty soon, SNCC formed, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The students got some support. In Spelman College in Atlanta, where a lot of the SNCC activists came from, there were 2 faculty members who supported them, Howard Zinn and Stoughton Lind, both expelled. But they did get some support, and the Freedom Riders, Freedom Buses started. There was little participation from the North. It was very brutal. People were killed, beaten, not fun. I mean, I remember demonstrations as late as 1965 in the South, where there's just brutal police violence and repression. The federal marshals there kind of watching and not doing anything. But it did get some gains. It hit a limit. It hit a limit as soon as it reached the North. It's kind of striking. Martin Luther King in 1966 expanded the movement to Chicago. Then they were just dumped on miserably.
Yeah, one of the side effects of the Civil War I've noticed in studying history is that people north of the Mason-Dixon, since they were institutionally against slavery, think it's impossible for them to be more racist or as racist as people south, when it's often not the case. Some of the most segregated schools are in New York State, for instance. This is in 2020, by the way. Some of the most segregated schools. So it's not surprising that the civil rights movement faced more opposition in the North than they did in the South, because I believe that people, and I've gone back and forth on this in my life, but at this point in my life, I believe that people are fundamentally good. So that means that people who are fundamentally good recognize the problems with racism and the Jim Crow laws. But if you lived in the South, you really couldn't speak up against those or you would be socially ostracized. But in the North, you don't have that kind of thing in your face. So you just look down on the Southerners who have those laws and don't think about how you may or may not be reinforcing racism or harboring racist sentiments in the North. So when people come and say, hey, things ain't equal here, we need to change it, then that gets resistance because, oh, we're not racist like those Southern people. There's no Ku Klux Klan here. There's no Citizens Council. We're the enlightened Northerners. You need to go back to Alabama. You need to go back to Georgia. It's hard to get people to confront their intrinsic racism, especially if it's not as overt as other places. Because as long as there's someplace worse, then you're not as bad.
It was an effort to mobilize the poor, mobilize people around slums. Moved on to the war in Vietnam. Huge antagonism. He ended up the way I described, just kind of written out of history by Northern liberals. But it did have success, and the successes are real, and we know how they were won. Same with everything else. The Vietnam War protests did reach a substantial level, but remember what it was like for years. I mean, when I started giving talks about the Vietnam War in the early 60s, it was in somebody's living room or in a church with 4 people, And in fact, if we tried to do it at college, say MIT, you'd have to bring together half a dozen topics and make one of them Vietnam in the hope that somebody would show up. As late as October 65, that's after what Bernard Fall was describing, what I quoted, in Boston, which is a liberal city, you could not have a public demonstration against the war, literally. It would be violently broken up, often by students. That's a fact. In March 1966, at this time, the hundreds of thousands of troops are rampaging in South Vietnam, huge destruction, country virtually destroyed. In Boston, again, liberal city, since we couldn't have public demonstrations because they'd be broken up, we tried to have one in a church, downtown church, Arlington Street Church. The church was attacked. Tomatoes, cans, defaced. Actually, there was a police contingent. I walked outside and stood next to the police captain and asked him, can't you do something to stop the defacing of the church? He said, nah, I can't do anything. About a minute later, a tomato hit him in the face. And in about 30 seconds, the place was clear. But that was going on in March 1966. A year later, there were big demonstrations. And there were no special kind of tricky strategy.
This is why we can't give up the energy Bernie has created. It starts small and it snowballs. Bernie, it kind of seems to a lot of people that, to a great extent it did, Bernie radicalized a lot of people at once. But he kind of radicalized them to what I am going to uncharitably refer to as Bernieism, which is Bernie Sanders is the only way we can achieve our goals. And that's just not the case. I think he was very strong, very smart to make his motto this time around, not me, us. To instill in the movement from the beginning of 2019 at least, that this movement is not about Bernie being president, it's about improving the material conditions of us. And that is something we need to keep going. Now we're filling parks, Bernie was filling stadiums, but that was for Bernie. That was for a political candidate. We need to start filling parks and stadiums for people who are advocating for things more directly. Not necessarily firebombs and revolution, but to get this idea that we can create a better world. And frankly, platforms like Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, those are great places to keep the fight growing. That's part of the reason why I'm doing this. To keep that fire burning and keep stoking it. Because it's the only way we're going to achieve change. We can't just sit around every 2 years, every 4 years, and wait for some politician with the right ideas or who claims to have the right ideas to step up and make the changes. We need to represent the changes we want to make. Yes, never advocate for political violence. Political violence is bad.
Strategies, just what we all know how to do. If people don't want to think about facts, try to bring out the importance of understanding facts, which after all, everyone knows. In fact, if you look at public attitudes, even Tea Party attitudes, they're kind of social democratic, literally. So for example, among Tea Party advocates and of course the rest of the population, a considerable majority are in favor of more spending for health and more spending for education. They're against welfare, but more spending to help.
This is that whole, how do you feel about the ACA? Oh, I hate it, or I love it. How do you feel about Obamacare? Oh, it's the worst thing to ever happen. One of the things about polls is how, I remember watching the Penn and Teller bullshit episode on numbers. And one of the things they did was they talked to a professional statistician, someone who makes surveys and does them with people to get information. And one of the things he demonstrated was how you can get the answer you want. Would you deny service to an undocumented immigrant who went to the emergency room? Do you think that undocumented immigrants' children should be able to go to public schools? And I forget the third one, but it was like, do you think that undocumented immigrants' children should go hungry because they can't get food aid or something like that? So something that any reasonable person would say, yes, I think we should help them if they're sick. The kids should be able to go to school. The kids shouldn't go hungry. Do you think we spend too much on undocumented immigrants? Absolutely. But you think we should help them if they're sick and go to the emergency room? You think their kids should go to public school? So you see, depending on the question you asked, depends on the answer you get. So if you sculpt the question right, you can get the answer you want. This is why there's a lot of disparate information about support for instance, Medicare for all. If you ask people if we should, if the government should spend more on healthcare, if we should change the healthcare system, you get like 96% yes. But as you refine that, as you change the question, and one of the big things is whether you mention that you would no longer have your private insurance or not, then the approval goes down. And again, there's the difference between, do you think medical care, healthcare should be available to everyone regardless of income? Most people will say yes. But when it comes to actually trying to implement something like that, that's where the devil is.
Say women with dependent children. That's the result of very effective propaganda. Ronald Reagan, one of his great successes, was to demonize the concept of welfare. So welfare means, for Reagan, Reaganite rhetoric, a rich black woman driving to a welfare office in a chauffeured Cadillac to take your hard-earned money and spend it on drugs or something. Well, nobody's in favor of that. But are you in favor of what welfare actually does? Yeah, that ought to be supported. And I just don't think it's true that people don't want to hear about facts. I mean, the same is true on health, on the deficit, on the things I mentioned. Not 100%, but there's a fairly, for example, about, I think it's 2/3 of the population thinks that corporations should be deprived of personal rights. That's a pretty significant move. That would undo a century of court decisions. It's not just Citizens United, it goes back a century. And that's against the will of about 2/3 of the population. Well, all of these things offer plenty of opportunities for discussion, interchange, education, organizing, activism. The opportunities are all there. It's mostly the will to undertake them that's lacking. And it's not easy. I mean, there's costs associated with it. So, undoubtedly, even for privileged people. But, not the costs that people like us can't bear. Not that kind of cost.
Yeah. Wise man. Very, very wise man. We could all learn, you could all stand to listen to him more. The other reason why I wanted to talk about this video, so it came out in July of 2015. Chomsky's Philosophy, this channel, has 207,000 subscribers. Let's see, I just want to see what other videos they have here, just as an idea. Okay. So it looks like they put out videos fairly regularly. Well, not fairly regularly, but they've got quite a few videos here of Chomsky. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and add to this. I didn't even realize. But this video has one comment. And this is a comment that gets worse as you read on. I'm on the right. I believe strongly in the Constitution and in the traditional values and customs of the United States. I love this country. I hate that we are so divided these days. I don't want to feel this hate that keeps bubbling up inside me towards the political left in this country. I really don't. We used to be able to agree on a certain middle ground and had things beyond politics that held us together. So far, he's pretty much been a standard, traditional conservative, the ones that were more sane and less fascistic. We would disagree on policy, but on the big issues that affect us, we could find compromise to some livable extent. Watching the political left attacking everything the people on the right find important is starting to become very difficult. Imagine how we on the left feel. And the left despises us as well, although I'm not quite clear why. I don't want to force anything on them. I just want to be left alone, which I believe most right-leaning, freedom-loving people feel the same. That's where I see the difference. When the left takes power, they want to force gun control. Keep in mind, this comment came out 7 months ago. People have been claiming that the left in America have been trying to take your guns since fucking Reagan. And yet all that's happened is a few restrictions on people's ability to buy certain kinds of weapons and the kind of magazines that were allowed to be manufactured and imported into America. They even left grandfather clauses in so that you could hold on to your guns if they didn't meet the current rules, but you could prove you owned them before the rules were drafted and went into effect. So this is a lie. Force gun control, the want to force free this, free that, all at someone else's expense. No, we just want our tax money to be used to help our people, help the society, not to continue to fund endless wars and global imperialism that we can't afford. I could care less if you're gay, just don't force your lifestyle down my throat. I could care less if you don't want to support our flag, just don't force everyone else to suffer by fighting the display of the flag. To my knowledge, no one is really fighting displaying of the United States flag. There are some people who don't agree with what it stands for, but I'm not aware of any movement to stop people from displaying the flag. Like, that's a complete straw man. As if he wasn't making straw man everywhere else. I could care less if you feel more comfortable dressed as a woman. Just don't force my niece to be exposed to a guy in the girls' bathroom, or force everyone else to deny reality along with you. There's a transphobe. I could care less if you hate religion, just don't force the rest of us to never say a prayer in public. Again, our issue is not people praying in public, it's religions being preferenced over non-religious. I could care less if you don't like guns and don't want to own one, but don't force me to give mine up and pretend that it will make anyone safer or that people intent on evil won't keep theirs. Good news, David Kaiser. I'm a leftist. I don't want you to give up your guns. I just want you to be educated and responsible with it. That is all. This talk of civil war is upsetting. I'm not going to discount the feelings of all those on the left. I'm sure just want to be free to exercise my views as well. I'm sure lots are good, decent people. We really need to try and get back to freedom-oriented values and embrace that. I fear that's impossible, though, because everything I hear from the left feels anti-freedom. I only know one thing for sure when it comes to civil war. It will be very ugly and unpredictable. Nobody knows who will win. Nobody really wins. Our way of life will be altered forever. I'm not naive. I don't think it's going to get better, but we should all try as hard as we can while still holding true to our values. I agree. The only problem is that, as demonstrated in this comment, our values are quite different. So we're going to have a disagreement on what we should do if we're going to stay true to our values. But Chomsky's based, and more people should be listening to him. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you liked it, like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thank you. See you next time.